Go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, folks. Glad to see you here. I'm Keith Hazelton. I work as a senior IT architect at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've also been involved primarily through Internet 2 and in Common in identity access management, IAM middleware space for something over a decade at this point, and have worked with several of you in the room in one capacity or another. I'm here really to talk today about this approach to a common framework, common design for RESTful APIs that's coming out of this Cypher Shared API Working Group. The topics that I'd like to walk through today is a kind of background, so why are we doing this work, developing this framework. Second, a bit of a walkthrough, not of the whole framework, but of some key elements to give you a flavor for what this set of guidelines looks like. Then actually dive down to a few examples of real-world APIs that were developed in conjunction with or in alignment with this framework. Then I have a couple kind of more speculative or open-ended thoughts around first the SCIM, this new specification, relatively new, that speaks to some of the same concerns that we were addressing in this shared API working group in Cypher. So what the heck about those two things? And then finally, as you know, resources, the notion about resources is pretty fundamental to RESTful APIs. But very often, almost always, we find ourselves wanting to pair RESTful API kinds of actions with messaging and notification event-driven kinds of operations. And there's some things to observe there, I think. We're very early in thinking about this, but maybe some ideas that we could apply out of the API work that might make sense in the other sphere. So who are we talking about when we talk about this Cypher Shared API Working Group? Well, we've got representatives from a number of the key open source identity access management software products involved in this as a kind of working group members and showing up pretty much on a bi-weekly basis for a series of conference calls. And we've been doing that for something like a year and a half now. I would say the last year or so, we've really picked up the pace. And we've been working, as I say, on our own individual products and projects. But as a team, as a collective, we've worked on this framework idea that we'll be talking about for much of the presentation. And then what we're doing with the framework is then taking it back home and applying it to the work we're doing on our projects. Some of the key folks, not everybody that's been involved in this certainly, but just to give you an idea of the span, here we've got Jim Fox from the University of Washington in Seattle, a real pioneer and thought leader and actually great developer in this space, doing things for the University of Washington, but using a lot of these open source products. Myself, Chris Heiser, I would say the lead developer for the Grouper project, open source project. Ben Oshman from the various places, including the Spherical Cog Group, working in particular on the Open Registry product and ID Match, both of which have APIs that will get mentioned here. Brian Savage from Boston University brings a real interest in RESTful approaches to things, but who is very pointedly not a Restafarian, not a religious partisan about this stuff. And I think it's fair to say all of us are out of that camp. We're looking at this fairly pragmatically, for what works and what helps. Not that we get every last item of the dogma down. Bill Thompson from Unicon, and Jimmy Buccolo, whose his work will be kind of featured here, talking about an identity registry called Central Person Registry, developed at Penn State, but now open sourced and used, among other places, in the Commit project that you may have heard about for an independent IDP for students before they actually show up on our campuses. So those are the folks, that's the group that's working on this stuff. Now again, to kind of refresh memories about the IAM, Identity Access Management, in context here, we've got the whole suite of things here, essentially from left to right, with the green in the middle being the identity services, the IAM infrastructure, if you want to call it that. We've got identity information sourced in various systems of record. You were here yesterday hearing Ben Ocean talk about the ID match. That's where our ultimate knowledge of people tends to come from originally. And then over on the right-hand side, out the other end of the IAM infrastructure, you have the consumers of identity information, everything from cloud services to local applications and directories and so forth. The main point here is, lots of boxes, lots of lines. So the world of IAM and IAM integration in particular is this kind of interconnected services, both from the source systems on the left and consumer systems on the right, but also between the IAM services themselves and the green boxes. So the green boxes in the identity services column here with red outlines around them are ones where members of the CIFER API working group are actively involved in developing solutions, essentially implementations of those capabilities. So that gives you some idea of how this looks. So getting into the substance of the thing here, why APIs in general, and then in particular why RESTful versions of APIs. Well, if you start from the previous picture, you'll say that the characteristics that you really like the whole IAM infrastructure and its components to have is that you have modular services. That is, we have the different boxes for provisioning and for identity registry and directories and so forth in the identity services space. Those are modular in the sense that they come as a chunk of functionality that then interacts with the other modules. That's one key goal. And the other big one, of course, is loose coupling between services and their consumers or their providers, so that we can swap things out and readily connect things up through standard practices. So if those are the design goals, then it puts a focus on interfaces. In that previous diagram, the circles in there were the kind of interface points, and that's really just, interface is just a word for those places where the services actually talk to each other. So that's kind of the most general term. The slightly more specific term is API, Application Programming Interface, live published, implemented representations of these interfaces. And then, as I said, RESTful APIs are a style or a subtype of various possible APIs. You can have APIs in Java and anywhere else. But in the RESTful case, we've got an emerging paradigm. I think it's pretty solidly out there now, showing up across all kinds of domains, not just IAM, and across projects and products. So why the rise of this RESTful paradigm to things? I think the reasons are legion, but I've tried to highlight a couple of the main ones here. I think that is, it's leveraging a protocol that pretty much any developer is already familiar with, for which there are many, many libraries. So that's the HTTP protocol. And it leverages to the full extent the HTTP methods or verbs, get, put, patch, post, and so forth, and delete. And it really, the key here really is that this focuses on resources which in the RESTful API world are essentially the URI that resolves to some entity that we're talking about here, a person or an address or a group. So that's really the kind of core features of the RESTful approach, and you use those standard verbs to do the CRUD operations that you've got to do in any kind of system like this. And yes, the RESTful approach can yield this coupling that we're trying to get to and maintain. The language of implementation of the client and the server side are independent. You like Python, you can use that. PHP, as Ben Ocean jumps to, and even Java, as Bill and others tend to go to. But you got your choice there. You can go where you want to get things done efficiently, and they can interoperate through this standard. The services are also location agnostic. You'll notice that the RESTful APIs are usually defined by a fragment of the URL, kind of the right-hand side of the URL. To switch the location of the service, you're just swapping out the left-hand side that points to the particular host. So I think that's you know, some of the why that we're headed this way and why it's working. It's not just about the buzz. What has this working group been focused on lately? It's producing this IETF Internet Draft Style document to kind of create a public version of the thoughts we've come up with in this space. So it's Cipher API Framework 01, and the URL is there, and I have sent the slides off to the conference folks, so they'll be available there for people to look at and comment on. I've got a link to the working group mailing list at the end of the slides that we would really welcome input on this. It's at the point where now would be a great time to shape this up and tweak it and get it closer to the way we really want it to be. So this framework is really, as I say here, collaboratively developed standard, maybe guidelines, set of guidelines is the right term for this thing. And we're doing it, I guess, first and foremost for ourselves, again, back in our work on our own projects, Grouper or CPR or Open Registry, but also in our institutions, in the IAM projects we're doing there. So the idea is we have to like it ourselves individually and speak up if we don't. And I think that's led to a fairly good process to come up with a rough consensus on what's in this thing. But really the beneficiaries in the longer run, and the reason to go to the trouble, is that this is an approach where the developers that are trying to work with multiple IAM services, to the extent that those IAM services expose standardized APIs and do things in a similar manner across services, that makes the life of the developer easier. So you learn the approach once, and the first thing you work with, say, central person registry, and then if the next quarter you're working on a grouper integration, guess what? You already kind of know what those calls are going to look like and how to interpret. You probably even got some libraries to do the processing. So that's the real goal, is making life easier for the developers. So now a bit of the walkthrough, again, not the whole document, but just some of the things that give you a sense. We start off with the kind of obligatory statement and definition of what we mean by RESTful. We've talked about this really already to a degree. And the basic notion is that the resources that we're talking about here, first and foremost in the IAM space, are people and groups. Not the only resources out there, as we'll see, but those are the most fundamental, most basic, most everyday used resources that we're talking about as being addressable, accessible via URIs. And then the RESTful approach gives us a way to search and get those things, or put a new one in, or change one that's already there, or delete it. So no surprises there, but just to say what we're thinking of here. Then under this section 5.1 on grammar and formal constraints, we make some points that, again, just to, I think, more give a flavor than to be considered any kind of tutorial or detailed walkthrough with a quiz. We do think it's a good practice to do this thing where you indicate major versions of the API. So we certainly think these are going to evolve over time, right on the URI path. So if you've got a /v2 before you get to the actual method of the API, that's going to tell you this is the published version 2 of the thing. And then the question becomes, well, what counts as a major version upgrade? And so we have some kind of criteria for saying when would you find yourself wanting to create, go from V2 to V3. Well, if you've got incompatible representations of the resources, if that fundamentally changes things, or new parameters, or new headers, or headers that are changed from the way they were and would break implementations, that's one really good sign that you want to rev the V2 or to V3, for example. If you change, yes, Keith?
Is the version for the entire spec, or is it for the individual services? So can you have a V2 for the person match service and a V1 for the group?
I would think we will find ourselves in that situation because the developers are working independently. So yeah, I mean, it would be a humongous coordination effort, right, to get everybody in multiple open source independent projects to move at a time. So your point, I think, or I can see an implication of your point, which is if one of the components revs up to V3, any place that's calling that is now going to have to
be compatible with the V1 version.
Right.
Right.
So I think then that's a consideration that has to be in there. It's the reality of independent projects, but I think what it says is be careful in your initial choice of things so you don't have many of these things that would trigger a major version. Minor versions is essentially something that we think can live in the response metadata as opposed to the URL, so you don't have to change those every time some new field gets added or something like that. Data and field formats, so yeah, standard things, but again, just saying them and then let's agree to do it that way. Using Unicode expressed as UTF-8, using the ISO standards for timestamps. Again, if you're just genning up an API on your own, you might say, well, I'm just going to do it. I just need, year, month, and day, so I'll just put it that way with hyphens between. But again, if other developers are going to be using this stuff, and they've done it once for the ISO 8601 format, it's pretty easy stuff to just leverage that. So we decided to put that in. I think we've got a little more discussion about this duration notion. This P1.81s is a P for period of time, and the S is for seconds. So there's this question, well, can't you just use like millis for milliseconds or something? But again, our stance at this point in this draft of the guideline is let's use ISO 8601, and again, we can figure out how to deal with that. So some more on data and field formats. Camel case, wherever we can do it, essentially, is the recommendation here. And if you've got something like URI, which when it's by itself tends to be all caps, we're saying, well, just so do the U, really do camel case. And there are non-terminating discussions about that kind of thing too. So we're just putting a stake in the ground, and again, seeing if any of us find that just too painful. So far, no, that's fine. When you've got fixed field values and emails and things, sometimes you don't control the vocabulary. The institution specifies that official legal name has got to be in all caps with underscores or something. Well, if that's the value in a field, then you're not going to mess with that. But if you get to say, if you have some discretion in that case, then use camel case for the values as well as the actual field type. So attribute and values in that way. Letters, starting with letter, etc. And we use this notion because very often we find that we want to have something where we can specify, say, the type of an identifier. So in this example, we're saying in number 8 that we use the URI style, which is to say we specify a scheme and then a part within that scheme. So if we're saying that Chris Heiser's net ID is net ID colon M. Heiser, or we use a different scheme, user ID, and then that's some other value. Again, just to standardize on it. So request methods, this is the get, put, post, delete, all that patch. A post is an interesting case where we need to override that sometimes because it's a way to get a request body into the flow of things, and you can, in other words, you can use the post just so you can get the request body, and then inside the header option, we're saying include an X HTTP method override with the thing you're really trying to do. So I'm using the post to get the request body in, and then but what I'm really trying to do here is a get, because I need to specify some fairly detailed information, say in the get. So what do we have on the horizon or already in place in the way of APIs that have come out of this working group, and in particular with an eye to cases where we've aligned with the framework. So we do know about a couple of these open source identity registries. The Central Person Registry from Penn State, I've already mentioned. Jimmy Buccolo is the key developer from that project that's on this working group. And then, of course, we have the Apereo Open Registry. I think there's a session coming up right after this about Open Registry and production. And those are the components, again, where the system of records flow in and you rationalize, join the identities appropriately, and then flow them into the rest of the identity services. So in the case of the self-person registry from Penn State, again now open sourced and available on GitHub, and running in a kind of Cypher IAM testbed as a service that runs our identity registry for that set of test operations is Jimmy's CPR code. And that CPR work actually, well, there were a set of SOAP-based web services in CPR. But Jimmy had already decided, and the folks at Penn State had decided they wanted to do a RESTful version of this as well for all the kinds of reasons we've talked about. And his timing was good in the sense that we had at least a first version of the framework in place before he had to define these things. So in fact, CPR is an example of a project where the whole design of the RESTful API was done by adopting the framework and aligning it to the extent possible. The URL at the bottom here is essentially the design wiki for the CPR, a particular part of the design wiki that works on the RESTful service model. It's a functioning identity registry used in production at Penn State. And this, if you compare the framework that we were talking about before with the documentation for CPR, you'll definitely see that the guideline does not attempt to lay out, here's how you do an API, A to Z. It's just some guidelines, as I was trying to say, that shape how you would do that. Because if you look at this CPR document, you'll see what it means to really define API, all the methods for all the kinds of resources, people, affiliations, addresses, contact information, and so forth. It's a great job of documenting it and a really good guide, I think, to the kind of API work that needs to be done in this space. So just to take one tiny piece of that CPR API work, the basic operations on people. We've got the basic four, right? Add, update, archive, and get. Well, archive is we always make this joke of identity registries that it's like the Roach Motel. People check into our identity registries and they never check out because they come in as applicants and they leave when they're as alumni who have passed on and gone through probate and left their endowment to the university. So we don't want to lose the identities once we get them. So that's why in the third row here you see instead of a real delete operation, we've got archive, which is just our way of saying you get it out of the active pool, but it doesn't go away. It just goes into some other wing of the identity systems. But again, you've got the basic four methods, and you'll notice that the add a person method just is very simple. It's the version and then people and then a body of a post that says what to do. We'll see an example of that. But all the other methods tack onto that this URI style thing of an identifier type, colon, and then an identifier value, meaning when we're going to update or retrieve a person, we really need to say which resource. So this is one of those examples of resources. We'll see the identifier types in the essentially response to the creation that I'll look at next. So here's from the documentation on that website the add person operation. And again, we've got this set of attributes. We're using JSON. The guideline says JSON is the default, and if you choose to support XML, you can do that in a query parameter and specify that you want the XML version of things. But in this case, we've got who's doing the update, and then basic information, name, address, and so forth on a post operation. And if that's successful and a new person is created, we get back a 201, again, standard status code or response code from HTTP with some information that, again, that's specified in the guidelines saying you get the resource, of course, a representation of that with information that in this case, the CPR has created or looked up, in this case created, for that person, in particular a number of identifier types and identifier values. You see that under person ID, 12334, user ID, and so forth. So those are all these kinds of pairings that will uniquely identify this newly created person. Then you've got resource metadata that essentially says, okay, well, this particular person ID 121234 was created, last modified in this case, on that date, and the base URI is just the identifier, and a status code is success. There's also, that's the resource metadata. There's also some metadata about the response, saying when that came in and what the status code. And this is the place at the bottom there where you would put the subversion, the minor version, think if that came through. So there are, of course, several of these response codes specified. These are the ones that are actually listed in our guideline. There are many more. But the ones that are a bit interesting to look at here are the 409 and 412 series. When you're going to put a resource, that is, replace the existing resource with a new one, you've got to be sure that you're up to date with the current state of that resource. So we're saying you need to use an if match header in there to saying, I know the latest kind of rev of this person resource is etag value such and such, and if you leave that if match header out, you'll get a 409 when you try to do this, create a new person. If it doesn't match or some other kinds of failures happen, you'll get a 412 coming back. So again, just basic guidance on how to do this. An example of a different kind of resource here, we've talked about people and groups is the most fundamental. In the Penn State case, they have this notion of affiliation, student, faculty, staff, and so forth. And you use a post to add a value to an affiliation to a person. You'll notice in the top that we've got people, so we're talking about person resources, identifier type colon identifier, so we can put in PSU ID value, user ID, whatever. In either case, that would point to a particular person. Then we go to the affiliation resource, so that URL is pointing to an affiliation tree or an affiliation resource space. We've got essentially a very simple addition here, adding value of student. And what comes back from that is this affiliation key. Essentially, it's a unique identifier for that particular value of affiliation that was added. If you later want to remove that because the person lost their student status, you pass in this delete method, which again, we're, in Penn State terminology is called archive. And the line at the bottom essentially shows you specify all the way down to the affiliation value. Then you've got a query string on there requested by so-and-so. This is a form of authorization check for the API to know is it, not just anybody can archive people and change their affiliation from student to non-student. So, and notice that in this delete operation, since the required information is pretty simple, we don't need a post operation at all. Every piece of information we need is right on the URL string. So looking at some other framework-aligned APIs, Ben talked quite a bit about the ID match API. This is the thing that comes into play when the system of record says, I've got what I think is a new person. They're an employee that just got hired, but they're not authoritative for this. The identity registry is, and so when they pass that quote-unquote new person from their perspective in to be registered in the identity store, you need some way to hear back, whether that person really is known to the registry already or generally really unique. And the point about the ID match API as an independent service is that then you can plug it into your sort of identity registry of choice, CPR Open Registry. And I think the first place this thing is actually going to get used is in the Open Registry product. But it's interesting to note here that the CPR work predates the ID match API, certainly the API implementation. So there's a kind of built-in, much simpler notion of ID match in the CPR. And so how does this one work? It's, if you do a post, the example we saw to create a new person came back 201 created. That's a standard response code. But if it comes back 200, which is just okay, in the CPR world, that means I found given the information you told me to post to add a new person, I found one exact match according to CPR logic. So I'm going to give you a 200, and that's your signal that we already know this person, and it'll, the system of record will get back those identifier types and identifiers so that it can know how to refer to that person that they think is a new person, but is actually a new employee who used to be a student. If it comes back with a 300, which is a standard status code for multiple choices, essentially that's a signal that there are more than one resources that matched, and it comes back with that information. That leaves a lot of work to be done by the system of record to figure out what to do with that, but ID match doesn't claim to be magic. The point here, I think, is that CPR, if they continue evolving at Penn State and other places, very likely will, I know they've already been looking at the ID match API in the commit project implementation of CPR. And if they did that, they'd have a much richer set of functionality. You'd have to do some code and process refactoring to make that all work. So switching to another set of resources here, the groups and related resources, we can look at the Grouper open source project. And again, Chris Heiser has been the one representing that on working group calls. Grouper, as you know, is a tool for managing groups and permissions across needed services in the IAM infrastructure. Grouper has had, again, both SOAP and RESTful web services in place since I don't know which version, quite a few years now. And it predates this standard shared API working group and the framework. But Chris has said that when he gets this next release of Grouper out the door, he's going to have some time to go back and essentially tweak the APIs to produce a set that is more aligned with the framework. You'll see in the examples at the bottom here, it's not quite, the existing versions aren't quite in alignment with that. Again, because Grouper's been out and deployed for quite a while, I don't suspect he's going to get rid of any of the existing web services, the REST ones, because that would break a bunch of folks' real implementation work. But the style here, it isn't that bad, but so get members of a group thing essentially goes off to groups, and then you'll see this thing that says A-stem, :3A group. That's essentially the grouper notion of folders, and then within folders groups, and the 3A is the colon between them. So he's identifying a particular group and then saying, I want the members' resources of that group. So it's going to bring back a list of people who belong to that group. A comparable kind of call is to say, okay, I know who I'm talking about, you person such and such, person 1002138. I want to know all the groups that they belong to. So you get, again, a group on a get on the subject's resource. You identify the subject by identifier, and then getting the membership values from that resource. So really it's the membership's resource for that particular subject. But the point is you can drill down and look at resources that are lower in the tree than people and operate on those in the RESTful style as well. So it's a kind of recursive approach to the notion of resources. The thing that's interesting about Grouper is that it's really a quite rich set of entities that Grouper is interested in managing. There's the obvious ones, groups, and folders for groups. Members are the people. Of course, a group can be a member of another group, so members can be either people or other groups. Groups can be used to carry roles, so a particular group might represent a particular kind of role. Attributes can be attached to groups to say things like, who's allowed to, when the thing was created, or which organizational group is responsible for it. Privileges are essentially the things like who can administer the group and who can view the membership of the group, and things like that set baked into the Grouper case, and these are all, again, accessible via the APIs. Permissions are really the interesting and rich one, where you can essentially define the right to perform particular actions, customizable actions against arbitrary resources. So essentially, Grouper uses a kind of simplified group representation to represent the resource, and then you can define actions over that and then grant people insert people or roles that permission over that arbitrary resource. So it's a lot more than, as we have been harping on, this notion of just people and groups. So that's there to be taken into consideration. So that's, as I say, several of the specific service specifics areas where we've been working on the API. I wanted to switch again to these more speculative topics for the close of the session. A couple slides on this notion of SCIM. So system for cross-domain identity management. Used to be simple cloud identity management, but nothing with simple in the name lasts very long as simple once you start working on it. Only the URL is still simple. That's how you can get to the work, including the specs. Version 2 of the SCIM specification is under active development. There is an IETF working group. We're really pushing hard to get to closure on that. And the design center for it, in an elevator speech version of this, it's about provisioning users and groups to external services from some kind of service that server that knows about identities. So again, users and groups, guess what? They're coming to the front and center here. The URL at the bottom takes you to the RESTful API that's been defined for SCIM. Again, quite complete, exhaustive API for how they propose to do this. So, serious body of work, got some real momentum. So it raises the question, do we need really both SCIM and Cipher API framework that we've been talking about here? There is, you can imagine essentially doing away with the Cipher-specific thing because SCIM does have this provision for schema extensions. There's the basic one, and then SCIM itself defines a kind of enterprise user in addition to just user, which is their word for people. So they've already given one example of that. Chris Heiser has already done some work to show how you could represent, say, Penn State-specific extensions in a SCIM framework. So it could be done that way. But the counter considerations that make us think twice about this is an ongoing discussion, I would say, within our group. It doesn't cover all the kinds of resources. Remember that list that I just had up about the kinds of things that Cooper could manage. SCIM doesn't really speak about those. And it isn't really suited to natively handle multiple roles. If you look at the Apereo Open Registry product, it will talk about multiple roles for a given individual. And there might be a whole set of structured information and attributes associated with the role for a person. So that kind of subtree under a role for a person, again, is not something that SCIM out of the box is expecting to see. It does have an attribute called role, but it's a simple attribute that just carries a string value that says what kind of role a person is in. So it's not intrinsically immediately obvious how you would do that. But again, given, if you look at the list at the bottom of the corporations that are playing a role in defining the spec, Oracle, Salesforce, Cisco, and SailPoint, and those are only the primary authors, money would have to be on the side of saying, yeah, this is going to get some vendor adoption and pick up. There's been, I would say, some dismay that it hasn't happened already, but then again, it's an evolving spec that's in version 2 draft, so maybe it's not a terrible surprise that this hasn't already shown up everywhere. Certainly those of us on campuses trying to do cloud integrations would love it if the cloud providers said, oh yeah, we do SCIM, then we'd be in business. Point being, we can expect that to come true to some degree, and to that extent, we really ought to, in our Cipher API working group, define SCIM variants for the core methods that this talks about, so we can do it the SCIM way if and where we need to. So as I say, this is a lively one for discussion and thought, and we really welcome some help in thinking that through and figuring out the right approach and right division of labor. The final topic I really wanted to just touch on is this notion of a lot of us are trying to get to near real time by having event-driven messaging kinds of connections between components of our system. And when you think of events saying something changed, well, the something is a resource typically, right? So that's the kind of anchor point for thinking about these things as alignable, if not already aligned. So again, if we could represent resources in our RESTful APIs in the same way as we represent resources in a message that talks about things happening to them, we'd all be better off. And again, the ultimate beneficiary of all this would be the clients that are developing software to deal with. Both make calls to the API, but also process a message queue coming in, telling them about near real-time changes. There's a kind of skeletal suggestion of early ideas about this out on the shared API site. It talks about a notification proposal. In this version of things, the message really only identifies the resource by its identifier, essentially by its name. And if the recipient wants to do something other than know that something happened, they go retrieve the resource. And again, if these things are aligned, it's a trivial operation to go retrieve the resource using the API. So in this case, we're pushing a message to a messaging endpoint at the bottom here. So we're saying to an event and then specifying some service that the event is happening on. So it might be the identity registry. And then a serial number for the event. You could imagine doing this in different ways, but serial number is the most generic. You could call it timestamp, that serial number if you want. And then it's pushing the body of the message here, which is just the number, the actual resource, the thing called entity in the middle line there is a person of a certain enterprise identifier, and there's the timestamp for when this event happened. So now the messaging endpoint could do the call to get that person back and do their operation. It is quite simplistic, as I say. There's a kind of counterpart version to it where the client is doing a kind of pull and saying, I want to see all the events that have happened since the last one I looked at was serial number 102, so show me everything that's happened since serial number 102, and you get back a JSON structure of events, in this case 103 and 4. So it's possible to do that. Again, that's probably the simplest possible version of things. And if you want to get fancier, and you could do it, that is Rupert to LDAP provisioning at the University of Washington is leveraging this kind of an approach. CPR uses messaging extensively. They're using ActiveMQ. University of Washington tends to use Amazon simple notification and simple queue service to do this kind of thing. But in both those cases, the message can indicate not only the kind of change, again, add, delete, however you want to think about that, the resource URI, of course, but in some cases where it's appropriate, where it makes sense, the actual representation of the full resource itself in the message. But again, my point is it's really very early in thinking about this, again, an area where we will develop in thoughts. So wrapping up, again, we've centered on people and groups because they're the predominant entities and resources in this domain of identity management. And we pushed forward on that, both in the framework and in particular service implementations. If you're doing work that has IAM integration points, identity and access management, somehow tends to show up in most things that people really need to do. This work might be of direct benefit, so we would hope that that turns out to be the case. But just as a kind of throwaway remark, this general notion of things could apply in other completely different domains than the IAM space and to theoretically multiple types of non-person resources. So, you could take this and apply it anywhere that you're working on things like this. As I said, this is the URL to subscribe to the mailing list where we put notices and agendas for the calls and talk about the latest rev of things. So please subscribe there, show up, or ask questions now. I think we're right at the 10:45 remark, so thanks for your attention. Yes?
So more comments than questions, but perhaps you can also comment on the comments. So channeling Ken Klingenstein, it's all about the attributes, right? So there's an accompanying document for the API work that describes sort of standardized names for common attributes. So right, it's given name, not first name, and the reasons for that. So that's kind of one part of it. And the other part is sort of I think there's maybe an open-ended question about the internationalization of the APIs, and what would that mean? And so it's one thing to be able to say add a language encoding for name, that seems pretty straightforward, but is there more stuff that needs to happen?
Yeah, the core schema, again, is an area where you'd want to have the one eye on the skim space, because they've done the schema as well as the API. So that space is pretty thought through. We have the core schema. We have the, I guess you would say, the Open Registry has been developed in line with that core schema.
It informed it as did CPR
Right.
and some other projects.
Right, and CPR too. So the whole schema question is another side of the question we didn't get into here today, but time was limited. Yes.
Yeah. Do you all, or do the like SIS vendors participate in any of your, your discussions? Because I'm thinking there's the last section here on event processing. Lucian has an event processor they use for the SIS to LMS communication. As students add drop goes through their event processor. It'd be great if they could, kind of use, or that you could work together to collaborate to make sure you're using similar or same or similar standards, or at least standards that can be, can talk to each other.
Yeah, I'll let Niels respond first.
As a comment to that, we've been working on doing skim to whatever protocol you have on the other side as an approach. And actually, we found some commercial companies that would be happy to actually do that for us. So we simply state that, okay, you skim on one side, and I'll let the commercial company figure out whatever connector is needed to talk to whatever you have on the other side. And that at least, okay, you need to pay for that. Hopefully only once, or at least 50 times or 20 times for each institution. And it's significantly eases your burden, of course, on your side.
Yeah, I think the closest would come to that, there's a CIC, which is the Big 10, but it's really 15 or so now, working group called the Cloud Services Cookbook. And there are sections in there around provisioning, and skim is pointed out there, but some kind of, that's really been a challenge to get vendors and commercial providers into the conversation about this stuff. That's not just our experience, but I think in general in integration with, say, open source components. So it's a challenge, but I think we've figured out a few ways to have the conversation if the other parties show up. Niels's approach is we'll meet them halfway, and we've got this partner that will deal with the mess on the other end of things which exist today.
I definitely second your remark on the difficulty of getting commercial vendors to adopt basically anything. Anything but their own API.
Right. Right. Well, you want to connect to us? Well, just set up a special purpose LDAP for us. The other 6 that you have for other vendors. Anything else? We're over time, so probably let you go. All right, thank you.